Eetta Prince-Gibson is Moment's Israel editor and the former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Report. In addition to Moment, she also writes for The Forward, Foreign Policy, Haaretz, and Religion News Service. Her award-winning stories have appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, Slate, Hadassah Magazine, and other prominent publications. Eetta is a frequent lecturer on Israeli society in Israel and abroad. Nadine Epstein is an award-winning journalist and author. She has been the editor-in-chief and CEO of Moment Magazine since 2004, and she's the founder and executive director of the Center for Creative Change. Nadine's most recent book is RBG's Brave and Brilliant Women, 33 Jewish Women to Inspire Everyone, which she wrote in collaboration with the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Please welcome Eetta Prince-Gibson and Nadine Epstein.
Hi, Eetta.
Hi,
I'm so
Nadine.
happy to talk to you today.
Great to talk to you. Thank you.
So, such big news happening in Israel.
Yep.
We saw the
Never
headlines.
a dull moment over here.
No, absolutely not. And we're here to talk today about this major Supreme Court decision that came down saying that the Ultra Orthodox men do not have an exemption and must serve in the Israeli army.
Absolutely.
This is such a long-standing issue, and I'm wondering why suddenly today, this week, now, this decision came down. Is there something about the timing we should know?
Yes and no. The timing, this is in response to a ruling a year ago. A year ago, when the court told the government that it can't play with this anymore, that it either passes a law to enlist the ultra-Orthodox or not to enlist the ultra-Orthodox or the ultra-Orthodox go in. The government passed a resolution saying, we're asking the army not to enlist them. In June last year, NGO type people went to the court. The court said, we're giving the government whatever time. They didn't say, but this is over. So specifically when they make a decision, we don't know exactly what day they're going to come out. What did add some urgency to it is obviously the war. So it's not like, why was it today as opposed to yesterday, but why was it now? For bureaucratic reason, but also for the fact that the army is saying very clearly, we need men in the army.
Okay, so it was a unanimous decision.
Absolutely.
And that's an important statement, I think. And I think there's probably a reason why they took their time to get to a unanimous decision, because this is so controversial. But I want to just step back and talk a little bit about the makeup of the court. In the United States, that's a very important issue. So less important perhaps in Israel, although it seems to be of growing importance in a lot of people's opinions. And I'm just wondering, it's not a court that's just made up of quote unquote liberals, whatever that is in Israeli terms. Just tell us a little bit about that. I think there are 15 members on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it's 15 members. This was a panel of 9, and it was unanimous.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some of those people have been appointed in the past few years by the more conservative, increasingly conservative governments, including by Ayelet Shaked from the previous government. But it's important to understand that what they were ruling on is this is huge, but it's also a technicality. The law exempting the ultra-Orthodox expired. There's no reason in legal terms, until the government comes up with another one, which will be challenged, to exempt them. I'm not sure that in that sense, liberal, conservative, it meant a lot, because they really are looking at something that is almost technical. Of course, it isn't. And they specifically all said, in this time, we certainly can't countenance this. But despite the huge implications of this, it actually came down to the fact that the government has no authority to maintain its position that the IDF shouldn't enlist.
Because no law was actually passed by the Knesset.
Exactly.
So before we go to that, let's talk briefly about the Israeli Supreme Court. The Israeli Supreme Court has been on the hot seat for quite a while.
Oh, yeah. We've written about it.
We've written about it and for years. And the seat has gotten hotter and hotter over the last few years. So I'm just wanted to remind us a little bit about, if you could just remind us a little bit about the differences very briefly between the Israeli Supreme Court and the American Supreme Court, because obviously the Israeli Supreme Court is working with, Israel is working without a constitution. And so this puts the court in a slightly different position. And I just wanted you to briefly tell us about that before we go into the reactions to what happened today.
Okay, the Supreme Court acts in two ways here. It acts like a Supreme Court in a way that you will be somewhat familiar with. It also acts as a High Court of Justice, which is more from the British system. It's not the only country that does that. And if you think of the High Court of Justice, it's justice, which gets interpreted in different ways. Okay, what is justice? What is equality? And you're right, in that sense, it doesn't have, there is no constitution. There were a set of basic laws that that the court assumed or did not, that's part of the whole argument, that they could use as a quasi into a constitution and certainly as a guide. The issue is also here that makes it very different is standing. In other words, you don't have to have it be your personal issue to bring it to the High Court of Justice. You can say it's an issue of a travesty of justice. So the guy who brought it in the name of the NGO that was leading this is not somebody who's saying, I get enlisted and the other people didn't. He's probably way beyond age of doing Miluim anyway. So those are two important things to note. And those are part of what's been very noisy, is who gave the court this permission, and which the court, some people say, assumed for itself, and who told you what justice is. The other issue, and this is what comes, in Hebrew we would say, misamha, who appointed you as the arbiter of justice? You, the court. The final thing is, does it have the right to oversee government decisions?
Okay, we're gonna get into this, but it sounds like in this particular case, it's a very technical decision. It wasn't made, but it has far-reaching ramifications.
Exactly.
But
I mean, I don't think they had any choice.
But we will get into a little bit more about the Supreme Court in a few minutes. I just want to point out to everybody that the word miluim means reserve duty.
Oh, I'm sorry.
and that Israeli soldiers, men and women, but particularly now, I guess men, after they've served their time in the army, when they're needed, they come back and they're in reserve duty.
And the age to which they will do reserve duty is being extended. Something else to know is that we've never had a situation of particularly the reservists being in the army for so long. Some of them are expelled out and leaving the army with a call-up notice in their hand for 2 months later or weeks later. We've never seen this before.
Yeah. So let's just talk a little bit now about the reactions. There's been a lot of reaction, and I just want to break down the reaction because obviously Israel's a very complicated society. I'm going to assume that much of the left and even much of the center has been very supportive of,
much of the right.
And much of the right.
Sure. Lieberman thinks this is the best thing, absolutely.
Religious Zionists who serve in the army are also very supportive of this. But
those who aren't in the coalition.
Those that aren't in the coalition. Okay.
Yeah.
So basically Netanyahu government, which includes the coalition parties, and also the Ultra Orthodox, are the ones that are against it. It sounds like really it's a minority, really, because this is of Israelis that are against this decision, but they're a very important and vocal part of the
They're
society.
12% of the population, to be
Okay.
specific.
12% of the population supported also by the coalition. And that'll bring us, we'll get back, we're going to get into Netanyahu in a second. So what was Netanyahu's reaction to this today?
Well, Netanyahu's response was that since his government is trying to pass a law that would deal with the compulsory conscription, why did the court have to say this now when they know very well that we're trying to pass a law? Typical of the court to intervene when it doesn't have to. You know, an overzealous, overactivist court. The Ultra Orthodox responded with lots of, they hate the Torah, they hate the state of Israel, the court are anti-Jewish. You know, it's the Torah that protects the state of Israel, that protects the Jewish people. And if we don't respect the Torah, I mean, a few weeks ago, the chief rabbi, who, by the way, is a civil servant, receives his salary from the state, announced that if this were to happen and they would be forced to go into the army, they will leave en masse. They will leave the country. Mm-hmm. So if you want to know what the other responses were, there were lots and lots of responses of.
Well, let me go back. I'm not there yet. I wanted to talk about Netanyahu. So, so let's talk about this law that Netanyahu is discussing. So the Supreme Court in Israel already years ago said that it was really important, like, we're going to rule on this unless you create a law. And there's been years have gone by and no law has been created.
Right.
Why is it taking so long? I mean, so this is Netanyahu who's been in power now for a while, but why is it taking so long is it even possible to pass the law through the Knesset? And so when he's saying this, is it really a possibility that there could be a law or that the law?
No, I don't think so. Members of his own party has said that they will not support it. Mm-hmm. The issue being,
and that's the Likud party.
Yeah, the Likud party, Netanyahu's, at least 4, possibly more members of Netanyahu's own party have openly said, we will not support this. Mm-hmm. Now, again, what you have to understand is he's looking at 2 needs. His base, what we call the Netanyahu supporters, what we call the Bibyists, and we'll be writing about this in a moment in the future, are very right-wing and very pro-war. They are serving in the army. So while there was ostensibly an agreement that the Supreme Court had overreached and, by intervening in the government, and this understanding of a what we call a majoritarian democracy, and Bibi would say, I was elected by a majority. Where's the court come off, being larger than the people? Now you have a split between the Ultra Orthodox, who obviously are in the same position that they were if they do not want conscription, and the secular or more traditionally oriented base, religiously traditionally oriented and conservative base, saying, we're being captured, we're dying, we're serving 9 months of reserve duty, and where are you? So for the first time, there's a split that's very, very obvious. The right isn't lining up. Now, how Bibi's going to balance those two is going to be interesting to watch. My guess is that he will try to placate the ultra-Orthodox, and we can get into that later.
So there's a lot of talk about, there's been for a while, that the ultra-Orthodox might leave his governing coalition. Everyone I've talked to and everything I've read has been that there's really no way that's going to happen, because they know that Netanyahu is their best hope, and that any other government that comes in is going to be less sympathetic to this cause. And it's not even really clear that Netanyahu is sympathetic to the cause, but he knows politically that it's something
exactly
that he needs to keep in order to keep his coalition together. So
exactly.
It's very unlikely that the ultra-Orthodox are going to pull out of this government. This government will not be falling. You agree with that?
Not over this. I mean, look, as we say that, in the Talmud, it says that prophecy was given to fools after the destruction of the Second Temple.
Mhm.
So at the risk of being a fool, no, I don't think the ultra-Orthodox will pull out. We will leave the country en masse when we don't speak English and don't have professions because we haven't gone to school. Where do they think they're going? We will quit. We will go to jail, all of that. I looked at the numbers, and although it looks like on one hand that the ultra-Orthodox parties were not able to present their constituencies with what they wanted, in fact, what happened is they're receiving more money than they did 2 years ago. Yeah, the money was taken off the yeshivot in June by the previous court. So they made it up. Money's fungible. It was 1.2 billion shekel 2 years ago, and it's 1.7 billion
Well,
shekel now.
let me ask you about that. Let me get to that in a second. So first of all, following this decision, the Attorney General of Israel has authorized 3,000, just 3,000 ultra-Orthodox to be drafted initially, which, first of all, we do need to say that there are some ultra-Orthodox who have served in the army and who do serve in the army. This is a very small percentage of men at this age, but anyways, 3,000 have been authorized to be drafted. When could that happen? And these are 3,000 people who are not voluntarily wanting to serve. There are ultra-Orthodox who do serve, again, a small percentage. So when would that happen? Do you have any sense of that?
The court specifically did not give a quota. The 3,000 comes from the army,
Okay.
not from the court, but it said you have to move on this quickly.
Okay.
What does quickly mean? Netanyahu is famous for not being quick.
I'm going to get to that in a second. We'll get to that in a second.
So the answer is I don't know.
Okay.
My guess
So
would be not tomorrow.
so part of what they did say is that the funding will be cut off for yeshivas that currently have draft age ultra-Orthodox men enrolled. But I understand that already in a previous ruling that this began to occur.
Right.
And so funds have been withheld for a while. But from what I've read, they didn't really make a huge impact because there was the ability to, funds are fungible, and two, there has been increased supporting from diaspora of
exactly
to fill that. So the ultra-Orthodox yeshivas haven't been really suffering. They've just stayed on as usual. I just wanted to know if there's more, now more funds are being cut off, when that happens, and is that expected to really have any impact given this fact that the ultra-Orthodox have been able to get income revenue from the diaspora and also have other sources of funding from the Israeli government?
How much of a difference will it make? It'll make a difference, not in yes and no. Much of the payment to the yeshivot is over individuals who are studying there. It's per person. So if, in a hypothetical, the 3,000 people came from the same yeshiva, which isn't going to happen, but just to make it easier, that would be 3,000 times whatever the stipend is that yeshiva isn't going to get. So there will be money taken out as per person who's enlisted. So the questions are going to be very connected. I would assume there'll also be greater oversight. The press will be on it. The legal people will be on it. The Attorney General is going to be all over it. So how much of a difference? Not that great, but at least the symbolic general funding for yeshivot and per student funding will be cut.
And this doesn't impact any of the other funding that schools are getting.
No.
The Orthodox get subsidies. So it's really only, it sounds dramatic, but it's much smaller than really we would think. It's not going to really change the lifestyle of the ultra-Orthodox.
Unless we start seeing them enlisted. And then we'll start seeing it, both the economic impact as well, as I said, on the per person. as well as the overall. I
And
think
we'll step back here and say that, you know, there are many Israelis, especially on the left, the center, and even the center right, who are very, very concerned that the ultra-Orthodox not only don't serve in the army, but they don't add to the GDP of Israel, and they only
right.
take from the GDP. And that's something, when I just was in Israel and interviewed over 35 people, um, almost every single person, even people on the right, were very concerned about the economic impact. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about. So we all know that Benjamin Netanyahu is a masterful politician, and how could he? There's no real appeal process for this
No,
particular ruling, but there are many other ways to slow this down, and also, if a new law could be passed, I understand it would start the legal process all over again. So what do you imagine is the Netanyahu's government's next step?
drag his feet
But
in the hope.
How does he drag his feet?
Well, I don't know. It's going to be summer, and then it'll be Tisha B'Av, and then in August nothing happens anyway. Then it'll be the holidays, and the Knesset goes into summer recess. All he needs to do is get through the summer recess, which is soon. And then basically nothing can happen. And then basically we'll hit the high holidays. So he really doesn't have to drag, and especially since the court said, you have to do this, but you didn't give him a date. Dragging his feet may not be so difficult. And he may make all sorts of what we call combination offers of, okay, Haredim, give up 3,000 of your people for whatever, and we'll come up with this. We'll see a lot of horse trading.
I heard this is part of what's been going on.
Anyway.
There's been basically the ultra-Orthodox have said, look, we're willing to make a compromise. We're willing to give you some of our non-yeshiva worthy men. And, there are these, but the compromises are all very minor and doesn't sound like the kinds of compromise that they're willing to make are things that are going to be really having any impact on the IDF, the need for manpower in the IDF, or even on the public's opinion. So
no, and also remember, it's kind of funny with when we're talking about the ultra Orthodox, and I know the expression in the United States is pork barreling, but there's all sorts of things that can be put into the law to smooth over other things.
So more money could be given to other things.
Money.
We'll take your young men, but then you'll get this. And you'll get that.
Yeah. We'll give you the worst. Not yeshiva, but really people who are on the margins, and then the army won't like it anyway because these are people who, were they not ultra Orthodox, would not be conscripted. There are lots of ways to play this. That doesn't diminish the significance, but the significance is symbolic before it's political.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the ultra-Orthodox community, which again is not just, it's very homogenous. It's homogenous, but it's still a complex society. I understand from talking to people that really within the ultra-Orthodox community that which yeshiva a young man attends is very important. And the timing of it is very important because
absolutely
your future depends on it. Who you get to marry depends on which yeshiva you go to.
Absolutely.
And leaving and going away for a few years, which of course opens up the chance that you might not come back. But even if you come back, it changes the society. It really has an impact on ultra-Orthodox society. I thought maybe you could tell us just a little bit more about that.
Well, I think there are a couple of things to look at here. One is, as you said, the common explanation has been either a kinder one and a more cynical one. The kinder is to say that Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, means fearful, anxious. What are they anxious about? Maintaining their lifestyle. And that requires being separate. They're not wearing separate clothes because they're comfortable in the summer. They're not wearing a fur hat in the heat of August in Jerusalem because it's cool. This is to be separate. It's that I can, as a Haridiyah, I can identify another Haridi. This is a community that defines its boundaries. And all of a sudden, it's not just that they won't be observing. They'll be wearing a different uniform that'll be the same uniform as everyone else. And I don't only mean that literally uniform. There'll be a question of who is the source of authority. Is it the rabbis or your officer? That's real clear in the army, isn't it? But it's not to many of them. So that's, the more cynical would be that they want to keep, that the politicians want to keep the Haredim basically
The syndicate
uneducated and separate, but uneducated and incapable of doing anything except being Haredi and increasing and having many more children, etc. That's the more cynical view. The kind of more sociological view would say because they are fearful of losing their lifestyle, which is based on separatism. I would also say that what we're looking at is what does this have to do? How do they view the state? And a lot of what's been coming up now and that we're seeing so much clearer is it's not just that they say, those who are against their exemptions saying this isn't fair. It isn't equal. Why does my son have to give up his life or risk his life or at a minimum give up 3 to 4 years and yours don't? That's not the questions they're asking. That isn't they don't feel the need to answer that question. The point is that the state has no intrinsic value. The only value that the state has is it allows Torah to be studied and God's way of being preserved.
And finances it.
Yeah, well, because
and protects, finances it and protects that way of life.
There's always all these comments, and I think in that sense, it's really non-Haredi societies becoming angry. You're always willing to let me die for you, and with the numbers going up. It's hard to hear that, it's not the soldiers who protect us. It's the Torah that protects us. Well, tell that to the people who are being buried in the hospitals and or wounded in the hospitals. Tell them that. And so what you're seeing is really coming into focus the ultra Orthodox view of the state and how instrumental it is. And I don't mean that cynically, I mean that in a theological way.
Well, this brings us back just very briefly to the origin of this exemption, which occurred in 1948 when David Ben-Gurion was putting together the state and wanted the support of, they weren't called ultra-Orthodox at that point, they were simply Orthodox. And there were so many ultra-Orthodox had been slaughtered during the Holocaust, and there were only a few hundred left. And in order to get the support of the Orthodox, who were not necessarily interested in a political state, he compromised. He said, "Well, we'll support Torah learning. We will support your few hundred people." Well, that few hundred people is now 12% of the Israeli population, and a growing part of the population, and will be a larger part of the population in the future.
And it's 16,000. I did some work on the numbers. There are about 13,000, I'm sorry, people every year, men, who would be conscripted if they weren't under this ultra-Orthodox exemption. That's a lot of people.
In a country where, how many men are there every year who go into the army? So, but it's small, it's a big percentage of the men.
Yes. And again, as you pointed out, it has to do with reserve duty as well. The conscription is part of it. Okay, 3, and now it'll probably go up higher years. But men, some women, and primarily men, doing reserve duty until their late 40s, some even later, depending on their positions. My husband there were years that he did 90 days a year of reserve duty. Not necessarily consecutive, but that's a lot of time to be
And
away
there's
from
a lot
home,
of, and
away from everything.
there are young people now who have been on reserve duty since October 7th.
Yes.
So there are some who've spent a few months and then were able to leave, but there are some that are still
And
talked
are
to a
being
number
called back up.
who
And
are
are being called back up.
be called back up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about the role of the IDF in all of this. So I mean, the IDF, how is the IDF involved? The IDF didn't actually bring this case to the Supreme Court. It came from an NGO. But what does the IDF think of it?
We need manpower. And I'm emphasizing manpower.
The IDF thinks that.
Yes. Yes, the IDF has said that. They are also people who are, IDF observers, publicists, and all that, who are noting, for instance, by age, that some of the men who are being killed in the conscripted units, in the standing units, are young. They've not necessarily completed all of their training. You could see from one that some of them were in officers' training because of the insignia that they were wearing. Not usual that the Army is pulling people out of training courses. That will have long-term effects. And if we have anything, an escalation on the north, the country is being pulled to the very edges of what it can tolerate.
So the ultra Orthodox already, as we pointed out, there are some who serve, and they are often serving in like their own units. But we're talking about, in this case, a much larger integration of the ultra Orthodox into the Israeli Defense Forces. And this brings a lot of, first of all, it will take time. And second of all, it introduces a lot of issues, including the role of women who have been playing an increasingly important part in some military positions and in leadership positions. So how does this really work?
We don't know. I mean, what the ultra Orthodox are saying, and even those who are in favor among the ultra Orthodox, and as you've said, it's not a monolithic community. And there are ultra Orthodox who are in favor of serving, are saying, but we need to trust that there isn't an ulterior motive here of unconverting us, making us non-ultra Orthodox. Is that what's really going on? You have to prove to us that we can trust you to respect our lifestyle.
I mean, how does any army do that? I mean, this is an army that's right now fighting wars and could be fighting wars on more than one front. Already is fighting wars on more than one front, and it could expand. So, is that on the IDF to, we've done stories about how universities now have like programs and classes that only ultra Orthodox attend, so they have a degree of segregation. But is segregating the IDF is a good thing? And especially when I've been talking to a number of people in the reserve who talk about the reserve as an example for Israeli society, where people really do, of all different kinds of backgrounds, serve together and create bonds that they carry with them outside once they leave. So I'm just wondering, how this
it's
works.
going to be a real question. I mean, are women going to pay the price? And that's why what I said, I emphasize manpower. Women are serving in more and more positions, including as pilots. Remember, there'll also be a problem that the majority of there's every reason to assume that the majority of ultra Orthodox who will be enlisted and conscripted in the next few years will not have a secular education.
No,
certainly not a broad
math,
one.
they won't have English, they won't have science.
So they're, we're going to start looking at cavalry and cannon fodder, and that's going to also make it more complicated. Then they're going to demand probably gender segregation, as well as segregation from the other guides. Gender segregation was already a problem when the first ultra Orthodox were serving. Were beginning to serve a few years ago, and for instance, the a very high-ranking female officer was not allowed. I mean, they rioted that she couldn't go on the base because they used the word sterili, which is not as awful in Hebrew as it would be in translation, meaning sterile, but that's not what they mean. They mean clean of women. And they wouldn't let her on the base. They rioted. And what does that mean? What does that mean for units? Will they take commands from women? Will they take commands from women as trainers?
So this
you know,
leads to a lot of other questions, like about education of the ultra Orthodox, and whether, when, and how they can become educated in kind of with English and math and science and all sorts of skills that they're not learning, so that they can join the economic. I mean, certainly some ultra Orthodox have, but the vast majority have not joined, like, the economic engine of the startup nation.
no.
So
If any, it's the women who've learned coding and things like that, but not the men.
So this is all preceded by the judicial reform controversy in Israel. And how does this decision impact that? What, the divides of the society about this particular issue are complex. It sounds like there's a wider number of people who actually support the ultra-Orthodox serving than support keeping the courts the way they are. So it changes. It's complicated. It shifts people. It's not complicated. It's complicated. But do you expect that after the war, that the judicial reform issue will once again become kind of front and center, and will this be part of it?
I think that the fact that the court, in the eyes of the ultra Orthodox, overstepped its bounds again will come up. The fact that the court nullified a government decision will certainly be brought up again. We, a democratically elected majority government, passed a resolution that the army should not have to call these people up. And then the court said we didn't have the authority to make that decision. Once again, it becomes who's the court to take that authority? Who appointed the court as the arbiter of the government? I anticipate that that'll come up. My guess is that a lot of it's going on under the table anyway, behind closed doors. Everybody's getting ready for the next day, whenever that means. But we also don't know, as we've written in Moment, what does the day after mean? So when you say when the war is over, to be honest, most of us are thinking, good Lord, what's going to happen tomorrow? And so it's very hard to know, which is part of the anxiety, of course, that's going on in Israel.
So there's very deep divisions right now tensions that have been brewing for decades between the executive branch, legislative branch, and also the courts. And so all of this, everything that's happening is playing out with that in context, with that behind it.
Absolutely. And the idea of clear divisions. This one is a split of what was once seen as a unified camp on the right that believes in a more, if you want to be critical, populist, if you want to be more objective, majoritarian government.
And a stronger executive branch.
And a stronger executive, and the rule of majority rule. And now that united front, if ever it was united, just split. Because on the one hand, if I were a supporter, I would say, well, I certainly want the ultra Orthodox to be enlisted. My son is serving, et cetera, or my husband or whatever. And at the same time, I really don't want the court making these kinds of decisions. And that's what Bibi's going to emphasize. You might have liked the decision, but think about the framework of the decision. It nullified a government resolution. So we're going to see some of this. Right now it's all up in the air, and I think it's going to start to settle. And as it settles, we'll start to see which of the narratives and which of the frames comes forward.
Well, thank you so much, Eetta. This has been really helpful. I thank you for taking the time out this evening to join us.
Thank you very much for having me.